With extracts from his own diary tapes, former Cabinet Minister Tony Benn traces how his attitude to Britain's relationship with Europe has changed.
In 1963, I was opposed to Britain's membership of the Common Market. But 4 years later, as Minister of Technology in Harold Wilson's second government, I was persuaded we had no alternative but to join. I argued that case in the House of Commons in July 1967, very late at night, and I had smuggled a tape recorder inside a book and taken it with me into the chamber. So this is the very first recording ever made of a parliamentary debate.
What we have to do here is to create an environment in Europe which is favorable to the creation of large companies big enough to stand up against the strong competition that comes from across the Atlantic. Now, of course, it was this argument, this type of argument, which shifted the views of many of my honourable and right honourable friends, and which quite frankly shifted my view on the European question and on our decision to apply to join the European Economic Community. It was the feeling that technology imposes an inexorable scale upon our economic life and makes it necessary for us to think in very much bigger terms than we had done in the past. It was the fact that the argument led you increasingly to the view that Britain's place within the wider Europe was its proper place and its necessary place and its inevitable place.
When Edward Heath, as Prime Minister, took Britain into the common market, I campaigned to persuade the Labour Party to hold a referendum. And when we were re-elected in 1974, the Labour government was committed to letting people decide whether we should stay in or leave. As the new Secretary of State for Industry in that government, I visited Brussels and learned at first hand what our membership really meant.
Tuesday, the 18th of June, 1974, caught the plane to Brussels for a whole series of meetings with commissioners. And of course they had all, no doubt, been briefed to win me round. A tremendous reception, huge day of visits and discussions. I want to report my feelings about going into the building in Brussels, huge building in the shape of a cross. Absolutely un-British and un-English. Even office blocks in Britain don't look or feel like that. Great big corridors, huge balconies, modern rooms looking out over Brussels. And although it was interesting to see a mixture of advisors of different nationalities, I felt as if I was going almost as a slave to Rome. The whole relationship was wrong. Here was I, an elected man, doing a job and could be removed, and here were these people with more power than I had, no accountability to anybody. I found this feeling built up throughout the day. Well, then I walked over to meet the councillors, people from the Foreign Office, Education Department, Trade, Department of Industry, Customs, Head of Chancery, Treasury and Legal Departments. And I said, look, let me put a point to you. I said, I find an enormous difference as a minister between now and 1970 when I left office, because this huge area of community business has opened up and I'm not in charge of it. Well, they said, we are all officials, all from different departments, but we're all seconded to the Foreign Office and we're responsible to them. And I said, well, that exactly explains how I feel when I come here and I'm a Foreign Office official too, a parliamentary Under-Secretary of State in the Foreign Office. And I find that on all the things I'd like to do, the options that would interfere with community obligations are just closed. They're not mentioned because, of course, they can't be done. This made it crystal clear to me. It was one of the most significant things, remarks made, that it does centralise power in Whitehall, in that the Foreign Office are in charge, and it's completely destroyed the informality of British government and the freedom of action and the nature of cabinet government. And the thing has just got this completely bureaucratic flavour. It's international, but it's bureaucratic. It's got no democratic accountability. It's just there, and its capacity is to say no. That was the end of my visit, and if I summarize it, it was depressing, gloomy, absolutely confirmed in a practical way all my suspicions that this would be the decapitation of British democracy without any countervailing advantage. The British people wouldn't accept it, and quite rightly so. There's no real benefit for Britain. I found it a most fascinating day. So that was my first visit to the Commission in Brussels, and one I shall long remember.
The more I saw of the workings in Brussels, the more convinced I became that democracy in Britain would be fatally damaged if we remained in. And I campaigned vigorously for a no vote when the referendum was finally held in June 1975.
Friday, the 6th of June. We had our 3 television sets all laid one on top of the other. The colour one, the black and white from Mum's bedroom, and my little portable, which wasn't really needed. And it was really very boring because it was an absolutely clear majority everywhere. It was only later in the day that part of West Scotland and the Shetland Isles voted no, and it wasn't significant. It was an enormous majority.
14 years of national argument are over. All those who have had reservations about Britain's commitment should now join wholeheartedly, without stint, in the task of overcoming the economic problems that assail us as a nation, and work wholeheartedly with our partners in Europe and our friends everywhere to meet the challenges confronting the whole world. Thank you.
Prime Minister, could
No
I ask
question.
you...
That's the making statement.
Well, that was the Prime Minister on the steps of number 10 on this historic day, 6th of June 1975, which Roy Jenkins earlier this afternoon called D-Day in the battle for making Britain really part of Europe.
And so at about 4:10, and this is all on my diary archives, though the recording is pretty poor, I went into the garden with Cal, and we sat on the bench where I had proposed to her in 1949, and I gave the interview to the press, made the statement, and then a whole host of questions, many of them, as were expected, about my own personal position and would I resign. And then I went to the National Referendum Campaign Party. Enoch Powell was there and a lot of other people. I said, well, Enoch, you certainly got the case across clearly. And the great merit of it was that it was good political education. Well, he said, the political education is only just beginning. So I said, what do you mean? Well, he said, let me tell you a story. I have just come from the ITN studios in a taxi. And the taxi driver said to me, are you Mr. Powell? And I said, yes. So the taxi driver said to me, Mr. Powell, what attitude are you adopting towards the common market? So Enoch said I was much humbled by this. And so I said to him, do you remember I used to be a member of the Conservative Party? Yes, said the taxi driver. Do you remember that I left the Conservative Party? Yes, said the taxi driver, I think I do. Well, said Enoch, do you remember why I left the Conservative Party? No, said the taxi driver. Well, said Enoch, how did you vote yesterday in the referendum? Oh, said the taxi driver, I voted no. Oh, did you, said Enoch, why? Oh, well, I heard there was some talk of a European Parliament, and I was not prepared to see the British Parliament put under a European Parliament. The point Enoch was making was quite clear, which was that the campaign hadn't gone on long enough for people to understand exactly what everybody was saying, but naturally they'd got hold of what it was all about. So that was the end of Friday the 6th of June, and of course I must record that at the end of the day the votes were 17 million for staying in, 8.5 million for coming out, and it was an amazing achievement to get as big a vote as that with absolutely no organisation, no newspapers, nothing.
But although we'd been defeated, it became clear that the common market was only the first stage of a much, much wider strategy to integrate the continent into a full-scale political federation. This came out 3 years later at a dinner given by Jim Callaghan at number 10 Downing Street for Gaston Thorn, then the Prime Minister of Luxembourg.
Tuesday, the 28th of November, 1978. I had to go to dinner at number 10, which I did do, for the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, Monsieur Gaston Thorn. And it was a very interesting dinner, actually. I scribbled a few notes on the menu.
at the end of the dinner, Jim said to Gaston Thorn, will you now tell us how you see the common market? And Gaston Thorn said, well, Robert Schuman, who was the founder of the common market, was born in Luxembourg, and Luxembourg lay between France and Germany and had been crushed many, many times. He didn't want another war. He wanted Britain to join the common market 30 years ago, and the main thing was to anchor Germany to Europe, and he was afraid that it wouldn't be long before Germany looked towards Eastern Germany and say, aren't we friends, aren't we cousins, and there would be unification. And it could be very dangerous because he didn't think that Germany was anchored entirely to the West. And he said, what we want to know is Britain in or out? So Jim said, well, I think I'll ask Tony Benn to answer that. So I said, well, I often think as I sit round the table in Brussels and look at all the other ministers that except for the Irish, we're the only country that hasn't been occupied or conquered by Germany, and we don't have that same combination of fear and respect. I think the problem of the federal Europe you describe is partly that the federalism is concealed. As Guido Brunner once said to me, that he thought the British pro-market people were a bit dishonest because they didn't really tell us where we were going. I said, I don't think there's any serious pressure to withdraw, but the effect of our membership has been to produce a radical transfer of power internally in Britain, from Parliament to the government, and from government to Europe, and from ministers to officials, and has brought in the courts. And I said, we'll have to chew over these issues like a dog with a bone for 100 years. Shirley Williams was next, and she said, I am a federalist, and Britain doesn't understand Europe, and there's a lot of silly harmonization that should be dropped, and none of us are sovereign anymore. And Thorne said, well, I'm inclined to say to you, very frankly, and this is what the continent says to you, if you don't like us, get out. And we don't really care very much. He put it much more nicely than that, but that was what he was actually saying. It's not offensive to you. Will you make up your mind whether you're in or out? And what gave me great pleasure about that was that the good old Labour Party, which doesn't represent a majority of the House of Commons or maybe of the country, has managed to keep the question open, and that's our most powerful instrument. Well, I had to go and vote, and I came back, and afterwards I just had time to say one thing. I said, you mustn't underestimate this, Prime Minister, that we haven't been invaded for 1,000 years, and we haven't had a revolution for 300, and democracy in Britain means a deep hatred of power and the centralization of power, and we also see the common market in that context. The arguments are going to be released again. They're very important arguments, and they'll have to be faced. Now, 20 years after the referendum, Britain is locked by the Maastricht Treaty into a full European Union, and both the main political parties joined together to prevent the British people from having any say in the matter. As Member of Parliament for Chesterfield, I voted against the Maastricht Treaty and set out my case in a speech in the House of Commons, because I believe that the survival of democracy in Britain and in Europe will be the central political issue in the next century.
What we are discussing is whether the British people are to be allowed to elect those who make the laws under which they're governed. That's what it's about. Nothing to do with whether you get more maternity leave from Madam Papandreou than you do from Madam Thatcher. That is not the issue at all. And you see, if we really are going along this route, and I recognize when the three front benches agree, I'm in a minority, I accept that, so my next job is to explain to the people of Chesterfield what we have decided. And the first thing I shall have to explain to them is, my dear constituents, in future you will be governed by people you do not elect and cannot remove. I'm sorry about it, they may give you better creches, they might give you shorter working hours, but you can't remove them.